In the quiet corridors of Geneva, where the Alps cast long shadows over the glass-paneled headquarters of global diplomacy, two of the world's greatest powers found themselves sitting across a polished table. It was not the sound of gavel strikes or aggressive posturing that filled the room, it was silence. Tense, deliberate, and oddly hopeful, the United States and China, economic superpowers, locked in an escalating trade war for over half a decade, had agreed to what diplomats carefully called a constructive dialogue. But what does constructive mean when it comes from nations that have spent years slapping tariffs, blacklisting corporations, and weaponizing supply chains? Outside, journalists gathered like moths to a flame, eagerly speculating over the closed-door meetings. Markets watched nervously. Allies leaned in, adversaries recalculated. Behind the brief smiles and carefully chosen diplomatic phrases, the world wondered, is this a turning point or just another illusion? For years, the US-China trade war has been more than a financial dispute. It's a clash of ideologies, technological supremacy, and global influence. Geneva, neutral and symbolic, became the unlikely arena for what may be the most consequential economic negotiation of the decade. And yet, despite the encouraging tone, no concrete deal was announced. Details were promised on Monday, a phrase that left more questions than answers. What was truly said behind those doors? Was peace possible or merely a pause in a much larger geopolitical chess game? This is the story behind that meeting. Not the sanitized press release version, but the deeper currents shaping it, the rivalries, the hidden stakes, and the silent calculations made beneath the polished surface of diplomacy. Welcome to the Geneva Gambit. Chapter 1. Roots of the Trade War. To understand the significance of Geneva, we must go back not just a few months, but years. The US-China trade war did not begin with a handshake or a headline. It began with a shift in perception, and ultimately, power. In 2018, then-President Donald Trump launched a full-scale economic offensive against China, citing massive trade imbalances and unfair practices. Billions of dollars in tariffs were slapped on Chinese goods, sparking immediate retaliation from Beijing. The rationale: protect American manufacturing and correct what Washington viewed as decades of predatory trade behavior. But the roots ran deeper than tariffs, a clash of visions at its core. The US-China conflict was about more than trade deficits. It was a contest between two visions of the global economy, one championed by a liberal market-driven system led by Washington and another embodied by China's state capitalist model, where industries are heavily supported, if not outright controlled, by the Communist Party. The US accused China of intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers, currency manipulation to favor exports, using state subsidies to give Chinese firms unfair advantages, expanding its digital and technological footprint into strategic sectors abroad. China, for its part, pushed back, accusing the US of attempting to contain its peaceful rise and using economic tools as a means of strategic suppression. The 5G and semiconductor front. Nowhere was the conflict more visible than in the tech sector. Huawei, China's telecommunications giant, became the poster child of the tech Cold War. The US blacklisted it, citing national security threats, and pressured allies to do the same. Behind the scenes, a deeper war was raging, one for control over 5G infrastructure, semiconductors, and AI dominance. Semiconductors, tiny chips with massive implications, became the new oil. Without them, smartphones, vehicles, weapon systems, and even power grids falter. The US sought to choke China's access to cutting-edge chips, enlisting allies like the Netherlands, home of ASML, and South Korea. In response, China accelerated domestic innovation, pumping billions into self-reliance. Economic fallout: the tit-for-tat tariffs hurt both economies. American farmers lost Chinese markets. Chinese manufacturers faced higher input costs. Global supply chains fractured. Multinational companies found themselves trapped between sanctions and dependencies. But the damage didn't stop there. Inflation surged, exacerbated by supply bottlenecks. WTO credibility crumbled as both nations sidelined the institution. Geopolitical polarization deepened as countries were increasingly forced to choose sides. The pandemic only intensified this rivalry. The US accused China of mishandling COVID-19. China retaliated with Wolf warrior diplomacy. Nationalism surged, trust eroded further. By the time the Geneva talks were proposed, the trade war had evolved far beyond economic grievances. It had become a struggle over the architecture of global order itself, a tired battlefield. And yet, both sides arrived in Geneva not with weapons drawn, but with folders and smiles. Why? Because the war, in many ways, had exhausted them both. The US faces elections, and inflation is still a hot-button issue. China's economy is slowing, burdened by youth unemployment, property crises, and a shrinking global appetite for its exports. Tech decoupling is costly and unsustainable in the short term. Allies are weary, calling for stability. Something had to give. And so, Geneva happened not out of friendship, but necessity. Chapter 2. Geneva. More than just a neutral ground, Geneva is not just a picturesque Swiss city surrounded by lakes and snow-capped mountains. It is a symbol of diplomacy, neutrality, and international order. For decades, it has played host to historic summits, arms control negotiations, and human rights conventions. But in the age of fractured alliances and rising great power competition, even Geneva must adapt. When the United States and China agreed to meet here, the choice wasn't accidental. Geneva offered what both capitals needed: symbolism without risk, gravitas without provocation. The optics matter. After years of jarring press conferences, nationalist soundbites, and tariff threats, Geneva provided a quieter stage. A stage where smiles and handshakes could be exchanged without either side appearing weak at home. A stage where failure could be downplayed and progress, however minimal, could be amplified. The setting: modern Cold War theater. The meetings were held inside the WTO headquarters near Lake Geneva, a building both literal and metaphorical in its symbolism. The World Trade Organization, once seen as the guardian of a globalized world, has suffered repeated blows to its authority, many of them from Washington and Beijing themselves. The US has criticized the WTO's dispute resolution mechanisms for years, even going so far as to block appointments to its appellate body. Meanwhile, China has been accused of gaming the system, using its developing nation status to secure trade advantages while behaving like an economic giant. Yet, here they were meeting under its roof. It was almost poetic, or ironic. Observers noted the change in tone immediately. No public ultimatums, no last-minute walkouts. Instead, a joint statement used a term that hadn't been heard in years: constructive. A single word, but in diplomatic language, constructive carries weight. It signals that while no breakthroughs have been achieved, lines of communication remain open. It allows both sides to save face and claim moral high ground. Reading the signals, seasoned diplomats know that what isn't said often matters more than what is. The joint statement mentioned no agreement, no timeline, no tariff rollback, no tech deal. It merely promised more details to come on Monday. It was a placeholder, a diplomatic comma, not a period. Still, the mood was different. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai emerged from the meeting with measured optimism, calling the discussions direct and productive. Her Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He Lifeng, echoed that sentiment, noting progress in mutual understanding. It was a far cry from 2019, when the two sides accused each other of betrayal in real time via dueling press releases. What changed? Part of it was necessity. Both economies were suffering from decoupling fatigue. Part of it was optics. China wanted to show it was not internationally isolated. The US wanted to appear firm, yet pragmatic, ahead of a tense election season. But most of all, Geneva offered a space where a reset could be attempted quietly, carefully, and without the noise of domestic politics echoing too loudly. The subtle art of multilateralism hosting the meeting under WTO auspices sent a secondary message. Multilateralism isn't dead yet. In a world increasingly defined by bilateral spats and regional blocs, returning to Geneva was a nod to rules-based order, however fragile that order may be. For Europe, especially, this was welcome news. Brussels has long lamented being caught between the tectonic plates of US and Chinese trade policy. A truce, even a tentative one, offers hope for economic stability and policy breathing room. Other players, Japan, South Korea, Australia, watch Geneva closely too. Their supply chains, exports, and national security strategies often depend on the temperature of US-China relations. For multinational corporations, this was more than symbolism. The idea that the world's two largest economies were speaking calmly again sent stock prices rising, albeit briefly. Stability is the one commodity markets crave most. A pause, Not a peace yet. Few were under the illusion that Geneva signaled the end of the trade war. No real agreements were signed, no structural reforms were pledged, no tariff timelines were committed. Geneva was not a breakthrough, it was a breather. A moment to step back, recalibrate, and perhaps even regroup. But sometimes, in diplomacy, a pause is the first step toward peace. And Geneva, with its neutral air and quiet dignity, has always been a city where pauses begin. Chapter 3. What was said behind closed doors? What really happens inside a high-stakes diplomatic meeting? The press sees only brief photo op smiles, handshakes, a few words to the cameras. But behind those closed doors, in rooms stripped of recording devices and lined with translators, legal advisors, and senior officials, the real game is played. The Geneva meeting between the United States and China was no exception. While the official joint statement used vague terms like constructive, productive, and open dialogue, sources close to the matter have since leaked subtle hints about what transpired and what didn't. A 3-hour strategic dance. According to insiders, the meeting lasted just over 3 hours, split into 2 sessions, one formal, one more relaxed. The first involved reading pre-prepared positions aloud. The second was more candid, more improvisational, a setting where true sentiment could surface. Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade representative, led a lean but experienced American delegation. Her message, according to sources, was firm but forward-looking. She stressed 3 key demands. 1. Protection of intellectual property, including curbing cyber espionage and patent infringements. 2. Fairer treatment for U.S. firms in China, especially concerning joint venture rules and regulatory discrimination. 3. Predictable trade environment, meaning no sudden policy shifts or unannounced tech restrictions from Beijing. On the other side, Vice Premier He Lifeng and his team came prepared with their own asks. 1. Tariff rollback. China wants the removal of Trump-era tariffs, especially on electronics and industrial goods. 2. Removal of export controls and blacklists, particularly on Chinese tech firms like Huawei, SMIC, and DJI. 3. Commitment to non-interference, an implicit call for the U.S. to avoid using trade tools for political leverage, especially on issues like Taiwan and Hong Kong. The elephant in the room: technology. Though both sides avoided direct confrontation during the talks, the topic of semiconductors and AI remained a point of palpable tension. The U.S. has tightened its grip on chip exports to China, particularly the most advanced nodes used in artificial intelligence and military systems. The Biden administration's alliance with the Netherlands ASML, Japan, and Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company TSMC has put China in a technological chokehold. Vice Premier He, according to reports, argued that technology should not be weaponized, emphasizing that export controls hurt not only China, but global innovation and supply chains. The U.S. replied with concern over dual-use technologies, goods that could serve both civilian and military purposes. In this subtle exchange, Geneva revealed its limits. Neither side was ready to budge on core tech restrictions, but for the first time in years, they articulated their red lines calmly. Face-to-face, climate, chips, and currency. Interestingly, not all discussions revolved around tariffs and sanctions. Both sides reportedly found common ground on a few key issues. Climate cooperation. Despite trade tensions, both the US and China reaffirmed the importance of cooperation on climate goals. A symbolic gesture, yes, but symbolism matters in diplomacy. Chips for cars. The global chip shortage, particularly affecting the auto industry, prompted discussions on coordinating supply stabilization. It's a small step, but one that signals functional collaboration is still possible. Currency stability. Quiet discussions were also held about currency manipulation and accusation Washington has levied at Beijing for decades. China denied any deliberate actions, but both sides agreed to maintain exchange rate transparency, according to a draft summary. The Monday report: the most cryptic part of the Geneva talks was the promise of details. To Monday, diplomats suggested that both sides agreed to a framework for a longer-term negotiation structure, possibly a return to biannual strategic economic dialogues, which were once routine in the 2000s. Additionally, there are hints of a sectoral working group model, where specific industries like agriculture, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and finance would each get a separate negotiation table. This compartmentalization would allow progress in some areas even if talks stall in others. Nothing has been signed, nothing formalized. But if confirmed, this would represent a return to structured diplomacy, a method the Biden administration favors and which China interprets as a path to predictable engagement. A fragile thaw. Geneva did not produce a miracle, but it did produce momentum. The room that had once been filled with suspicion was, for a few hours, filled with something approaching mutual recognition that decoupling isn't sustainable, and that talking is better than posturing. But the thaw is fragile. The Taiwan elections loom. A single U.S. arms sale to Taipei could derail progress. A cyber attack blamed on Beijing could reopen wounds, or a semiconductor breakthrough by a Chinese firm could spark a fresh round of sanctions. Still, in diplomacy, momentum is currency, and Geneva may have just minted some. Chapter 4. The geopolitical ripple effect. The Geneva meeting may have only lasted a few hours, but its aftershocks reverberated far beyond the quiet shores of Lake Geneva. When the world's two largest economies sit down to talk, even cautiously, everyone pays attention. Because what happens in that room affects supply chains, elections, currencies, and borders across the globe. And so, as the sun set over the Alps, capitals from Brussels to Tokyo, Delhi to Jakarta, tuned in not just to what the United States and China had said, but to what they had implied. Europe, between relief and realignment. In Brussels, the tone was one of cautious relief. The European Union has long found itself squeezed between Washington's hardline stance and Beijing's economic allure. With over €1 billion in goods traded daily between the EU and China, Europe's economy is tightly intertwined with Chinese markets, yet increasingly wary of Beijing's human rights record and state-led industrial policies. The Geneva talks offered something Brussels hadn't had in a while: breathing room. German automakers, French luxury brands, and Dutch semiconductor firms all stood to benefit from any de-escalation, however minor. The Geneva statement, though thin on substance, signaled that the trade war wouldn't escalate, at least not immediately. But Europe wasn't just watching, it was adjusting. Behind closed doors, EU officials began re-evaluating the pace of their de-risking strategy with calibration of economic exposure to China without going full decoupling. The Geneva talks gave them just enough justification to slow the process while still appearing cautious to their domestic audiences. Yet even in relief, Europe remained skeptical. As one EU diplomat said, anonymously, "Geneva is welcome, but we've seen this dance before." Words are not frameworks. Japan and South Korea, the tech frontline for Tokyo and Seoul. The Geneva meeting was not just about trade. It was about technology and national security. Both nations play critical roles in the global semiconductor supply chain. Japan controls high-end materials like photoresist and fluorinated polyamides. South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix are giants in DRAM and NAND flash memory. Any signal of thaw between Washington and Beijing directly affects these companies and the geopolitical balance around them. Since 2018, both countries have been under immense pressure to align with U.S. export controls, especially targeting China's tech ambitions. At the same time, their own industries rely heavily on Chinese demand. The Geneva talks offered a sliver of hope that some of this pressure might ease. But insiders in Tokyo noted with concern that advanced chip restrictions were still non-negotiable. This meant that Japan and South Korea would likely remain on the technological front line of the US-China rivalry. Still, Tokyo welcomed the return of diplomacy. As one trade ministry official told the Nikkei, "If Washington and Beijing are talking, it means we have more room to maneuver." Southeast Asia. Hedging made harder in Southeast Asia. The Geneva talks complicated an already delicate dance. Nations like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia have spent years hedging, trying to attract both Chinese investment and American security guarantees without choosing sides. The trade war had, in many ways, worked to their benefit. Manufacturers fleeing Chinese tariffs set up new operations in Ho Chi Minh City, Penang, and Jakarta. ASEAN economies became alternative hubs for global supply chains, but a thaw between the US and China, if sustained, could slow this trend. The Geneva talks hinted that tariff regimes might stabilize, reducing the incentive for firms to rush out of China. This meant ASEAN's balancing act would get more complex. The diplomatic ambiguity, that one served them well could begin to feel like strategic limbo. Nevertheless, leaders from the region welcomed the talks, if only to reduce volatility. As one Singaporean analyst noted, peaceful giants make better neighbors. India, eyes on the long game in New Delhi. The reaction was different, more analytical than hopeful. India has long seen itself as the third pole in a new global order. The US-China rivalry provides space for India to assert economic and geopolitical relevance. Geneva, in this context, was seen not as a breakthrough, but as a temporary truce. Indian strategists doubted it would last and quietly hoped it wouldn't. Why? Because prolonged US-China tension accelerates India's strategic relevance. Washington leans more heavily on New Delhi as a counterweight in Asia. Western companies look to India as an alternative production base. And China remains distracted, preoccupied with its American counterpart. Still, India was watching. If Geneva evolves into sustained engagement, New Delhi will need to adapt its pitch to investors and allies alike. But for now, Indian analysts treated the meeting as a pause in a game where they've increasingly found leverage. The global markets, calm, then questions. The Geneva statement caused a brief surge in global stock markets. The Dow Jones rose 180 points. The Hang Seng Index closed higher. The euro gained slightly against the dollar. But within 48 hours, the euphoria faded. Investors wanted details. What would Monday bring? Would tariffs be lifted? Would export bans be eased? Would tech companies regain access to Chinese markets? When none of that materialized immediately, markets corrected. Still, the takeaway was clear. Talk is better than silence. Investors prefer uncertainty with dialogue over certainty with conflict. The global message. The Geneva meeting didn't change the world, but it reminded it of something crucial, that diplomacy, however fragile, still matters. Even a handshake when delivered between rivals of this magnitude can ripple through continents, boardrooms, and war rooms, and as one former WTO official put it, in a divided world, the mere fact that the two most powerful nations are still willing to sit down is, in itself, an act of leadership. Chapter 5. The Battle Within. Domestic politics on both sides in diplomacy. External negotiations are only half the battle. The other half, often more turbulent, is fought at home. Behind every smiling photo in Geneva lies a storm of domestic politics, ideological fault lines, and national anxieties that shape, and sometimes sabotage, foreign policy. For both Washington and Beijing, the Geneva talks were not just a negotiation with each other. They were a performance carefully choreographed for domestic audiences hungry for strength, wary of compromise, and deeply divided on what the future should look like. United States. Between Congress and the campaign trail. In Washington, D.C., every foreign policy decision is filtered through the lens of electoral calculus. And with a presidential election on the horizon, Geneva was immediately thrust into America's most volatile arena, partisan politics. President Joe Biden, already preparing for what could be a rematch with Donald Trump, faces a domestic audience that is sharply polarized on China. On one end, moderate Democrats and globalist Republicans support engagement. On the other, populists on both sides of the aisle demand confrontation. Republican reaction. Too soft on China. Within hours of the Geneva statement, Republican lawmakers voiced skepticism. Senator Josh Hawley dismissed it as appeasement dressed in diplomatic language. Senator Marco Rubio warned that constructive dialogue was just a cover for Beijing-esque delay tactics. Fox News pundits echoed the sentiment, accusing the Biden administration of handing China a propaganda victory without demanding concrete concessions. For many conservatives, Geneva was a political gift and opportunity to paint Biden as weak on national security, tech competition, and American jobs. But the deeper concern wasn't just rhetorical. Many in Congress on both sides want to codify a harder line on China, permanent tariffs, restrictions on outbound investment, and bans on U.S. companies selling sensitive technologies to Chinese firms. In that context, Geneva was less a diplomatic win, and more a potential liability. Democratic dilemma. Walking a tightrope. Inside the Democratic camp, reactions were more muted but no less conflicted. Biden's team sees diplomacy as a stabilizing force. Catherine Tai's Geneva approach reflected that firm, deliberate, and structured. But even within the administration, there are diverging views. The U.S. Commerce Department, for instance, remains hawkish on export controls. The Department of State is more open to diplomatic engagement. The Treasury, led by Janet Yellen, favors stability and cooperation to preserve global financial flows. Balancing these factions while running for re-election is no small task. Biden must appear tough on China while delivering results that calm markets, support allies, and avoid war. Geneva was meant to thread that needle, but the real test lies in what comes next, especially as GOP challengers begin sharpening their knives. Beijing. Internal fractures, external facade. In China, where the outward appearance of unity masks intense internal debate, the Geneva talks were also politically charged. President Xi Jinping has concentrated power to a historic degree, but even within the Communist Party elite, factions persist. There are hawks in the military and security apparatus who believe any compromise with the US is dangerous and unnecessary. And there are technocrats, especially in the finance and trade ministries, who see dialogue as essential to rescuing a faltering economy. Geneva, while controlled in narrative, reopened this rift. Economic pressures are mounting. China's economy is under strain. Youth unemployment is rising. Property markets are stagnating. Foreign investment is slowing. Export numbers are volatile. To Beijing's technocrats, Geneva was a necessary signal to the global economy that China is still open for business and that hostility with the US won't spiral out of control. That's why Vice Premier He Lifeng's tone was conciliatory. But among nationalists, especially in the Chinese internet sphere, the reaction was mixed. Some praised the government for standing firm on core interests. Others questioned whether engagement with the US would lead to more humiliations, as past concessions were often portrayed. State media coverage was careful, using terms like mutual respect and win-win cooperation. But beneath the surface, party insiders know the stakes. If Geneva is seen as weakness, she may face pushback not in elections, but in internal party dynamics, where loyalty is absolute but patience is finite. Propaganda, public opinion, and control. Unlike in the US, China tightly manages public discourse. The Geneva talks were covered in major outlets like Xinhua and CCTV with cautiously optimistic headlines, but limited detail. This control reflects the party's awareness of its own people's shifting expectations. After years of Wolf warrior diplomacy, aggressive and combative, many Chinese citizens have been primed to expect confrontation, not compromise. To reverse this mood requires not just diplomatic breakthroughs, but a rebranding of strength from confrontation to sophistication. Geneva, framed carefully, may serve that purpose, but the margin for error is thin. Two governments, one anxiety. Domestic backlash. Though politically worlds apart, both Washington and Beijing face a similar fear. Domestic backlash. In the US, backlash could come in the form of primary challenges, right-wing media firestorms, and congressional investigations. In China, it could manifest as nationalist unrest, elite discontent, or economic panic if engagement is seen to yield no gain. This is the paradox of modern superpower diplomacy. Foreign engagement is essential but always vulnerable to domestic fire. And Geneva, while constructive, offered no clear win either side could bring home triumphantly. It was a neutral ground, not a battlefield, and thus harder to sell to audiences who prefer victory over nuance. As one former US negotiator put it, the hardest part of diplomacy isn't facing your adversary, it's surviving your own side. Chapter 6: What comes after Geneva? Scenarios for the future. Geneva was never meant to solve everything. It was not a summit of sweeping declarations or treaty signings. There were no podium fist bumps, no joint economic frameworks, no dramatic tariff rollbacks, but perhaps that was its quiet strength. In a world shaped by suspicion and shadow rivalry, simply talking constructively is a form of progress. Still, the question looms: what now? Where do the world's two largest economies go from here? The Geneva statement said that details would be released Monday. But more than official documents, analysts are asking, what comes next in the months and years ahead? Here, 3 plausible scenarios emerge. Scenario 1. Manage strategic competition. In the most hopeful outcome, Geneva becomes the starting point of a sustained diplomatic mechanism, a rhythm of engagement that helps both sides manage tensions while pursuing their own strategic goals. Under this model, the US and China would continue to compete fiercely in technology, influence, and security, but would do so within an agreed set of rules. Think of it not as cooperation, but collision control. Diplomatic channels would remain open. Regular economic dialogues, military-to-military communications, and crisis hotlines would be strengthened. Tariffs might be incrementally reduced, at least on non-sensitive sectors. Export controls would remain, but with clearer boundaries. Both economies would continue to decouple in critical technologies like semiconductors and AI, but without triggering sudden trade shocks. Financial markets, reassured by predictability, would stabilize. This managed competition would not eliminate mistrust, but it would institutionalize it, turning volatility into structure and hostility into ritual. This is the most realistic and desirable path, not peace, but order. Scenario 2. Détente and mutual adjustment. In a more optimistic outcome, Geneva sparks a deeper strategic rethink on both sides, a moment where domestic constraints, global pressures, and leadership decisions align toward de-escalation. Here, both the US and China recognize that open conflict, economic or military, would be catastrophic. They opt instead for guarded engagement. This would mean actual deals, phased tariff reductions, cooperation on climate change, renewed people-to-people exchanges, and perhaps even a framework for joint pandemic or supply chain response. Tech competition would remain but regulated. Investment flows could resume under tighter transparency mechanisms. Such a scenario would require political courage. In Washington, it means resisting populist anti-China rhetoric. In Beijing, it requires allowing more foreign access without fear of ideological dilution. The benefits would be massive: stable markets, renewed trust in global institutions, and perhaps the beginning of a new post-pandemic order. But it is also the most fragile scenario, dependent on variables like elections, global crises, and domestic upheaval. Geneva could be its seed, but it would require much more water, patience, and trust to bloom. Scenario 3. Relapse into confrontation. Then there is the darker path. Geneva, in this outcome, is remembered not as a turning point but as a brief pause before escalation. Negotiations stall. Monday's follow-up fails to deliver substance. Domestic pressures on both sides push leaders to abandon diplomacy in favor of confrontation. In the US, a more hawkish administration comes to power, perhaps reinstating Trump-era tariffs, expanding tech bans, and tightening investment restrictions. In China, nationalism hardens and retaliation increases. Boycotts, sanctions, military posturing. Economic decoupling accelerates. Taiwan becomes a hotter flashpoint. Cyber attacks, espionage cases, and diplomatic expulsions grow more common. Markets plunge, allies are forced to pick sides. And the world is dragged into a new Cold War, one with globalized economies, but frozen politics. This scenario is not inevitable, but it is very possible. Geneva's biggest risk may be the illusion of progress without its substance. If diplomacy fails to deliver real results, it can become ammunition for those who argue it was never worth trying. The wild cards. What could change the game? Between these three scenarios lie dozens of variations, shaped by unpredictable wild cards. Taiwan. Any military move or miscalculation here could derail every gain made in Geneva, instantly shifting the US-China relationship into crisis mode. Elections. The 2024 US election and China's 2027 Party Congress could radically alter the diplomatic calculus. A Trump return or a Xi political challenge would send shockwaves. Tech breakthroughs. If either nation makes a leap in AI, quantum computing, or biotech, it could redefine the balance of power and the urgency of control. Climate disasters. Large-scale environmental catastrophes may force reluctant cooperation as global challenges override geopolitical rivalry. Black swan events. A global financial crash, a pandemic resurgence, or a regional war could disrupt the careful balance Geneva tried to create. Geneva's true legacies. So how should we remember Geneva? Not as a summit of solutions, but as a symbol of something more elemental, the possibility of restraint, of realism, and of returning to the table before everything breaks. In a world drifting toward decoupling, deglobalization, and digital cold wars, Geneva proved that dialogue isn't dead. That diplomacy, even when quiet and cautious, still matters. It reminded the world that there is another way, not necessarily easy, or ideal, or guaranteed, but possible. A veteran diplomat once said, "Great powers rarely fall from being too weak, they fall from refusing to talk." Geneva did not solve the US China rivalry. But it kept that door open, if only for a little while longer. And in today's world, that might just be enough. And so, the story continues. The Geneva talks may fade from the headlines, but their echoes remain rippling through trade routes, digital corridors, and political war rooms across the globe. What was said behind closed doors may never be fully known. But what matters is this: the world's two superpowers talk. Not with threats, but with purpose, not with arrogance, but with urgency. Because beneath the nose of tariffs, sanctions, and summits lies a deeper truth. In an age of rising temperatures, economic volatility, and technological chaos, dialogue is no longer a luxury. It's a lifeline, but lifelines can fray if neglected. And history has shown us, time and again, that silence between empires is often the prelude to disaster. If you're watching this, you're part of a global audience trying to make sense of a world in flux. A world where headlines can feel like battlegrounds and every trade deal might be the start of something far greater. Or far more dangerous, so don't just scroll past. Stay informed, ask questions, follow the patterns. Because geopolitics isn't just about nations, it's about all of us. Subscribe to Econostate for more deep, cinematic explorations into the future of power, money, and diplomacy. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories behind the headlines. And share this video with someone who still believes diplomacy can shape destiny. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep watching the state of the world.